Today's passage is from the book of Micah, chapter 1, verses 1 through 6. Micah 1, 1 through 6. The word of the Lord that came to Micah of Morsheth during the reign of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. The vision he saw concerning Samaria and Jerusalem. Hear, O peoples, all of you. Listen, O earth, and all who are in it. The sovereign Lord may witness against you, the Lord from his holy temple. Look, the Lord is coming from his dwelling place. He comes down and treads the high places of the earth. The mountains melt before him, and the valleys split apart, like wax before fire, like water rushing down a slope. All this is because of Jacob's transgression, because of the sin of the house of Israel. What is Jacob's transgression? Is it not Samaria? What is Judah's high place? Is it not Jerusalem? Therefore, I will make Samaria a heap of rubble, a place for planting vineyards. I will pour her stones into the valley and lay bare her foundations. So, some of you know that I attended seminary out in Massachusetts, just a little north of Boston. And while I was out there, a buddy of mine told me a story. Now, to me, this story sounds highly suspect, but he told it to me as a true story, so that's how I'm going to tell it to you. Now, if you have never driven in the Boston area, then I recommend not starting now. I have driven in downtown Chicago, New York City, Washington, D.C. I can say with considerable confidence, Bostonians are the worst drivers in the country. As an example of this, a small town near where I went to school had a somewhat dangerous intersection. Now, the speed limit on this road was only like 20 miles an hour. There were not a lot of fatal car crashes here, but there were a lot of fender benders. And so, the city decided to do something about this, and they put up a stop sign. And everybody hated it. They complained constantly. They said it just slowed them down, it congested traffic, and it wasn't helping. There were still just as many accidents on this intersection. And so the city did a study to find out why people were still having accidents, and they found that they just were ignoring the stop sign. They would just drive right through it. And so the city put up a stoplight. The stoplight's bigger, it's more noticeable, you can't just tap the brakes at a stoplight, you have to actually stop. And there are not a lot of stoplights in eastern Massachusetts, so it was noticeable. And it didn't help at all. Still just as many accidents. And so then the city gave up. They took down the stoplight. They did not put up a new stop sign. They just decided this is going to be a dangerous intersection, and it still is. That's how the story ends. They just abandoned hope. The people would not follow their leaders, and so the leaders quit leading. They were not paying attention to the warning, and so the warning just went away. And that remains a dangerous spot. I tell you this story because something very similar to that was happening in Israel in the days of Micah. The people were refusing to listen to the warning of the Lord. The people would not listen, and the leaders failed to lead. Now, today we're turning our attention to the book of Micah. I think Micah is one of those forgotten books of the Bible. We often skip over it. I think that's a mistake. Beyond having some of the most important prophecies about Jesus Christ, it also happens to have my personal second favorite verse in the Bible. But more than that, Micah is about something important. Micah is about the character of God. Everything Micah wants us to understand is summed up in knowing who God is. And so, Micah begins his book with a short introduction, the way most prophets do, except for most prophets would tell people their family name. Micah didn't do that. It probably means he was from an unimportant or small family, and mentioning the family name wouldn't mean anything to anyone. So instead, he tells us that he is from the town of Morsheth. Morsheth was a fortified city about 22 miles southwest of Jerusalem. It was one of these cities that protected Israel's western border. Really, the only thing I can tell you about Morsheth is that it was small. It was about the size of Mount Auburn. So Micah was a country boy. He came from a very small town, but he lived most of his life in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem was the big city. It was the center of culture and religion and government. It was also, excuse me, it was also wildly corrupt at this point in history. Micah spent much of his time decrying the violence and bloodshed and idolatry that were rampant in Jerusalem. And so Micah begins by calling people to the Lord. Micah recognized this evil in Jerusalem. And while Micah lived in Jerusalem, he never really became a part of that city. Isaiah, another prophet who lived and served in Jerusalem the same time Micah did, was a part of Jerusalem. He traveled in the upper circles. He preached to the kings of Jerusalem. Micah did not. Even though he was in the city at the same time, he did not run in the same circles as Isaiah. Well, Isaiah was a part of Jerusalem. Micah remained a country boy at heart. As Isaiah preached to the kings, Micah preached to the people on the street, calling them back to the Lord. And Micah tells us that he served during the reign of 3 kings in Jerusalem. The reign of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. I'm doing a little math here. I know I hate math. Micah says he came to serve during the reign of Jotham. Jotham died around 749 BC. And he continued to serve on to the days of Hezekiah. Hezekiah came to power in 732 BC. So, for Micah to have been a prophet during all 3 of these kings' reign, he must have served for at least 17 years, probably longer than that. And this is important. This time frame matters because things were starting to happen in the nation of Israel. Micah went out to Jerusalem and he declared that God was coming to witness against the city. And right off the bat, that should have given people a warning. Because normally, the people would say that God was with the Israelites. Micah said that God was coming to testify against the Israelites. He uses the language of a courtroom, saying that God is coming down as the judge of the universe to testify against his people. And Micah is the 4th minor prophet that we've looked at. You may have noticed a theme that runs through these minor prophets. That is the theme of Israel's sin and God's judgment because of that sin. And Micah picks up that theme as well. He accuses the Israelites of sin. He says, what is Israel's transgression? Is it not Samaria? What is Judah's high place? Is it not Jerusalem? Okay, let me give you some context for those lines. At this point in history, Israel had gone through a civil war, and they'd been divided into a northern kingdom of Israel and a southern kingdom of Judah. And Micah first turned to the northern kingdom of Israel and said, what is Israel's transgression? Was there sin? It's Samaria. Samaria was the capital city of Israel. By the time we get to Jesus' day, the entire region would be known as Samaria. But at this point in history, it was just the one city. Excuse me. And Micah said that Samaria had become the sin of Israel. After the Civil War, after these nations were divided, there were still a lot of connections between these two nations. One of the biggest connections was the temple of the Lord was in Jerusalem, in the southern kingdom of Judah, which meant that at least once a year, all the people of Israel would travel down to Jerusalem to worship the Lord. And the kings of Israel said, if this keeps happening, people keep going down to Jerusalem, then I'm going to lose their allegiance. I'm going to lose their money. I'm going to lose my power. And so the kings of Israel came up with another plan. They built a new temple in Samaria. They couldn't compete with the authority of the original temple. That was designed by God himself. So instead, they decided that they would combine the worship of the Lord with the pagan gods of the nations around them. Say, we're offering you a new way to worship the gods. And it worked. I mean, at least they were successful in stopping people from going down to Jerusalem. But to do that, they corrupted the worship of the living God. And they turned Samaria into the sin of Israel. And then, having said that, Micah turned to Judah, the southern kingdom, and he said, what is Judah's sin? What is their high place? Is it not Jerusalem? Okay, a little more context. The pagans, the people who worship false gods around Israel, built their temples on hilltops and on mountains. Their theory was proximity. They believed that their gods literally lived up in the sky. And so if you wanted to be close to the gods, you had to get closer to the sky. And so they would build their temples up high. Now, to be clear, that's not faith. That's just superstition. However, the Israelites began to fall into that same kind of superstition. Jerusalem became their high place. Because the people of Judah said, we're safe because we have Jerusalem. We got the temple of the Lord. No matter what happens, God would never let his temple be destroyed. So it doesn't matter what we do or how we live. We're safe because we are near Jerusalem. They traded faith in the living God for superstition. They didn't have a relationship with God. They just were in close proximity to the temple. And they said that must be enough. And so Micah said that Jerusalem itself had become their high place, their superstition. And he warned of God's judgment. He said that the Lord would turn Samaria into a heap of rubble. Now this is something you've heard before. All the minor prophets warned that if the people continued to turn away from God, then God would overthrow the nation. He would send in the Assyrian army to destroy Israel and conquer the people. And God had been saying this for a while. And the people were getting tired of hearing it. They didn't want this message. They said, God's judgment. Yeah. But it hasn't happened yet, so it's probably not going to happen. God had been talking about this judgment for a century now. And the people were not listening to the warning. And now time was up. I mentioned a moment ago that Micah continued to preach into the days of Hezekiah. Hezekiah came to power in 732 BC. Less than 3 years after that, Samaria was destroyed. After generations of ignoring God's warning, God finally followed through. He sent in the Assyrian army to conquer Israel. Thousands of people were slaughtered. Those who survived were taken as slaves and shipped off to the far ends of the Assyrian Empire. The people had ignored God's message for generations. They dismissed his warning, and finally God followed through on that warning. He overthrew Israel and destroyed Samaria. As I think about this passage, I can't help but also think about a parable that Jesus told in the 25th chapter of Matthew. It's commonly called the parable of the 10 virgins. Jesus said that there were 10 virgins, what we would normally call bridesmaids, who were waiting for the groom to come to take them to a wedding. And the groom was a long time in coming, and so these 10 bridesmaids fell asleep. Then they heard the call around midnight that the groom had arrived. And so they woke up, and 5 of these bridesmaids had brought oil for their lamps and lit their lamps to go find the groom. But the other 5 had not brought any oil. And they asked the 5 who had brought oil to give them some. But the 5 wise bridesmaids said, if we give you some of our oil, we'll run out. Go buy oil for yourself. The 5 foolish bridesmaids went out to buy oil, but while they were gone, the groom arrived. The 5 wise bridesmaids went with him to the wedding feast, and the 5 foolish bridesmaids were locked out. Okay, the immediate context of that parable is the return of Christ and the end of this age. Jesus was telling us to be ready and wary for his return. Now, Jesus told us very clearly that no one knows when this age will end. No human knows, no angel in heaven knows. While Jesus was on earth, even he emptied himself of that knowledge. Only the Father knows when the end will come. So if someone tells you that they know when the end will come, if someone says that the coronavirus is a sign of the end, or the economic upturn is a sign of the end of this world, do not listen, do not be afraid. No one but God the Father knows when that will happen. Rather, Jesus told us to always be ready. That he told us to keep our faith burning. We do not know when the end will come, so live as a soul on fire. The end will come when no one expects it, so be ready now. That is the immediate context of this parable. However, I think we could apply this parable more broadly, because this is a parable warning us about the coming of God's judgment. To be wary of God's judgment. The Israelites had received God's warning. Again and again, God said he would overthrow the nation if they did not turn back to him. And again, they ignored that warning. They said it hasn't happened yet, it'll never happen. They did not fear God's judgment. And because they did not fear God's judgment, they turned away from him until at last God's judgment came and the nation was destroyed. The Israelites ignored the judgment and the warning of God until it was too late. So let's bring that to our lives today. God still warns us about sin. He warns us of the destructive power sin has in our lives. That sin is always self-destructive. That sin brings consequences into our lives. And he calls us out of sin. He warns us against its danger because our God is a good Father. He desires good for us. He desires for us to turn away from sin that we might have life in him. And sometimes we ignore that warning. Sometimes we ignore God's warning of sin in our lives. God is gracious and merciful, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love. He gives us warning after warning, calling us back to him. Sometimes we ignore those warnings. And when that happens, we imperil ourselves. So God warns us again. He calls us to turn back to him and turn away from the sin of this world. Jesus often described sin like yeast. If you put yeast in dough, then 2 things happen. One is the yeast is going to spread through all the dough. You can't put yeast into a little part of dough and then keep it away from the rest of the dough. It's all going to mix together. And second, yeast grows. It's what causes bread to rise. It expands in the dough. Sin works the same way in our lives. Sometimes we have this idea that we can keep sin separate. That I have a sin over here, but it won't affect the rest of my life. That never works. Sin spreads. A sin in one part of our lives is going to affect all of our lives. And sin grows. Sin expands in our lives. It always becomes more severe. It always will become more prevalent in our lives. And so Jesus warns us to cut it out of our lives before it has an opportunity to grow. And so I want to close today's sermon with 2 questions for you. My first question: is there a sin in your life that God has been warning you against? Is there something in your life that you know in your heart God has been calling you away from? It may have been a warning that he's been giving you for a long time. Is there a secret sin that God is warning you against? Is there a destructive habit in your life that God is calling you out of? What is the sin in your life that God has been warning you against? Second, what is the next step you need to take to free yourself from this sin? What do you need to do to be free? If this is a new sin in your life, this is something that's just started, it may only require a new commitment to turn away from sin. If this is a new sin in your life, make that commitment now, before sin becomes a habit. Because once it becomes a habit, it is much harder to break free. However, if that's already happened, if sin has already become a habit in your life, what's the next step you need to take towards freedom from this sin? Perhaps, again, it is just a commitment to the Lord, but if sin's become a habit, it'll probably take more than that. Maybe you need to set aside some time for prayer and fasting. If this has been a long-standing sin in your life, then set aside several days to fast. And in the time when you would normally be eating a meal, spend that time praying, asking God to set you free from this destructive habit in your life. Perhaps you need to confess your sin to someone. If this is a sin you have done against another person, you may need to confess to that person. Or if this is more of an issue of your own personal purity, then perhaps you need to confess to an accountability partner. To find someone to talk to that sin about that sin. To talk to about that sin. Or maybe you need to find an accountability partner. If this is a long-standing struggle in your life, maybe you need to find a person whom you can talk to. Someone who you can continue over the next weeks or months to talk to on a regular basis, to confess this sin, to have them encourage you to break free from this sin. Wherever you are in your life, if there is a sin that you know in your heart God is warning you against, what is the next step you need to take to break free from this sin? God warned the Israelites again and again and again. He sent his warning, and again they ignored the warning. They imperiled themselves until finally it was too late. In your life right now, is there a sin that God is warning you against? If so, what is the next step you need to take to be free? When we're going to stand for our invitation hymn, which is Room at the Cross for You, number 331. And as we stand to sing, if you need to make a commitment to God, if you need to make a commitment in your own heart right now to take the next step towards freedom from that sin, do that. As you sing these words, commit in your own life to take the next step towards freedom. As you'll stand with me for our invitation hymn, and we'll sing all the verses.